Berlin, 1940. Two massive bronze stallions stand guard at the centre of power, Hitler's new Reich Chancellery.
We are talking here, of course, about the most important statues of the Third Reich.
During World War II, the statues disappear without a trace for decades, until they turn up on the black market.
I know that in those circles there was talk of up to 8 million euros for both sculptures.
A major raid ensues.
It started in the early hours of May the 20th.
A story of Germany's dark past, featuring Nazis, the Stasi, the Soviet army, and lots of cash.
And then I got the call. We have the horses.
The late 1930s, German artist Josef Torek at work in his studio. Painstakingly, he modelled two larger-than-life stallions in clay. He had them cast in bronze, 3 tons of the stuff. The commission for the sculptures was for none other than the Führer Adolf Hitler. Hitler wanted the stallions near him at his new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the centre of power during the darkest years of German history.
These horses were placed underneath Hitler's office, so they got the most prominent place in the Third Reich. Art was very important for the Nazis as a propaganda tool.
A certain ideology can be interpreted. This extraordinary masculinity. They are stallions. The neck is extremely large and powerful, the muscles completely exaggerated. The whole thing exudes a certain power.
Whether horses, dogs, or even lion cubs, animals played a major role for the Nazis, especially for Hitler and his commander-in-chief of the German Air Force and Forestry, Hermann Göring. They used animals for propaganda, either to make themselves appear warm-hearted or to demonstrate their power, as with the horses at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The same place 8 decades later, Berlin's Wilhelmstrasse. The street at the city's centre is now lined with plain, prefabricated buildings. Under the Nazis, this area was a prestigious axis of power, full of big ministry buildings, the location of Hitler's birthday march and of his new Reich Chancellery. Today, a childcare centre and playground, where Hitler once made his monstrous plans. It was also here that he erected sculptures of his ideal German soldiers by artist Arno Breker. On the private garden side, Torek's 2 walking horses, as they came to be known, war horses, larger than life.
These horses saw everything. It's very symbolic.
In 1939, Germany started the Second World War. 6 years later, Berlin lay in ruins. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was over, his chancellery reduced to rubble. The Führer committed suicide in his bunker. His 2 bronze horses were destroyed, along with the city. Or so it seemed, for decades, until one day, Hitler's horses returned, back to their home city of Berlin. But how? And where had they been? Between their disappearance and reappearance lie over 70 years of checkered German history and a crime story, a very German crime story.
Everything came together, you know, a mystery, the hunt, the characters, people with Nazi sympathies. The moment I got the first picture, the color picture of the horses, when I started to realize they still might exist, at that moment I hardly could breathe. I knew if we are going to recover the horses, it will be the best story of my life, you know.
Amsterdam. This is where a key figure of this crime story lives and works. The legendary art detective who once recovered a Picasso worth millions and Oscar Wilde's missing ring, Arthur Brand. His work is not without its dangers.
I had 2 colleagues at the time, and sometimes we had quite some evidence that we were being followed. We had to deal with people, former Stasi agents, neo-Nazis, people with a lot of money. And sometimes we have discussed this, and we were quite certain that we were dealing with maybe dangerous people.
A good 600 kilometres away at Berlin's State Office of Criminal Investigation, Germany's top art cop was also hearing murmurs that Hitler's horses had resurfaced. Chief Inspector René Allange was already known for bringing down Germany's most brazen art forger. Now the inspector was fascinated by the case of Hitler's missing horses.
It started back in November 2013 when an elderly lady contacted us. She reported that she'd been made an offer to buy the horses by Thorak for an amount in the millions. I got interested when the lady also gave us a recent photograph, a color photograph, showing the horse sculptures. That got my attention.
The photo showed Hitler's horses in front of a plastic curtain. The dictator's enormous bronze sculptures suddenly appeared on the underground art market, on sale for millions of euros. René Allange and Arthur Brandt set off in search of the statues. But were the horses even the real deal? The immediate conclusion was that the sculptures must be a fake. Brandt assumed, like everyone else, that Hitler's horses had burned in the firestorm at the end of the war.
I thought, and most people thought, that the horses had been destroyed during the Battle of Berlin. We thought they must have been forgeries, you know. There are so many forgeries in everything in art, but also especially in World War II art.
But then Brandt made a discovery in the last known footage of the dictator, weeks before his death.
Hitler once again, for the last time, leaves the Reichschancellery. He looks at his last soldiers, and then I realized it was taken in the garden of the Reichschancellery, where the horses should be. But there were no horses, there were a guard of Hitler standing.
So in 1945, the horses weren't even in the Reichschancellery.
Soon I found out, no, these must be the real horses. And then I started to realize, if these are the real horses, my God, what a story it will be.
Brandt and Allange discovered that Hitler did bring his horses to safety. As early as 1943, before the start of the bombing raids over Berlin, he had them removed from the Chancellery. The Nazis wanted to protect their so-called Aryan art, like the works of Josef Thorak and Arno Breker, whose work glorified strength and power.
Nazis were undoubtedly art lovers. The 2 main characters, Hitler and Göring, even were competitors. They stole it, you know, everywhere in Europe they stole art, and they did love art. Of course, they did only love a special art. They didn't like modern art.
While Germany was losing World War II, the horses were no longer in the Chancellery. But where were they, and how could sculptures of that size and significance simply disappear?
The horses were brought to the town of Wriezen in Brandenburg for their protection, along with other works of art from Berlin and especially from the Reichschancellery. The plan was to establish a kind of artist colony for Nazi art in Wriezen. Arno Breker had his manor there as well as his sculpture workshops, which were very large, and the works of art were moved there to protect them.
We drive to Wriezen, a small town in the Oderbruch region north of Berlin. It was here that the Nazis built a gigantic artists' colony in the early 40s. The plan was to supply the entire German Reich with Nazi art. Berlin, Nuremberg, Munich. The choice of Wriezen was no coincidence. Arno Breker, another of Hitler's favourite artists, lived there. His manor house has since been demolished, but his studio remains. Today, sculptor Jörg Engelhardt works here.
This is the studio that was built during the war for Arno Breker, and that was finished in 1943.
The old park grounds, Breker's bathhouse and even his pool are still here. It seems like an ideal place to hide the horses. But Engelhardt has his own idea where they were kept.
The horses were definitely not here on the estate. There were workshops in Wriezen. The horses were probably there.
He might be right. Breker and Thorak competed for Hitler's favour, so it seems unlikely Breker would have had Thorak's horses on his estate. Parts of the old barracks and workshops in Wriezen are still standing. Hitler's stallions must have been stored here at some point, but where exactly remains a mystery. In April 1945, the Soviet army crossed the River Oder, reaching Wriezen. What did the Red Army do with Nazi art, and specifically Josef Thorak's bronze stallions?
There are a lot of unanswered questions in this case. It's a black hole how they ended up there.
Berlin. With so many unanswered questions, we go to see someone who knows a lot about the Red Army. The Museum Berlin-Karlshorst is dedicated to Germany and the Soviet Union in World War II. What state of mind were the Soviet troops in at war's end? How much art did the Soviet army loot? It was in this house that Germany's surrender in the presence of the Allies was signed on the 8th of May 1945. The Second World War ended right here at this table. What did that mean for the Red Army?
Everybody knew that this was the last stage. That's what they'd been told. They expected that if they survived this, then they had survived the war. What we know is that there was an order that members of the Red Army were allowed to send parcels home. For the generals, it was probably whole railway cars. There may have been art in them.
Were there orders from Stalin himself to steal art?
Right from the start, there were trophy commissions to examine specific paintings, sculptures, and so on. And then they were taken away as quickly as possible.
Is it possible that's what happened in Wriezen? That it was the communist Soviet army who organised the transport and theft of Hitler's Nazi horses? That's exactly what seems to have happened. Unknown to the detectives, in the 1980s, photos had emerged of Soviet soldiers standing in front of Hitler's horses. Soldiers from the barracks in Eberswalde, just north of Berlin, one of the largest Soviet army bases in East Germany. An East German underground artist called Pflanzendorfer secretly filmed the Thorak horses in the Eberswalde barracks. The horses, hard to believe, were on an athletic field. The images shaky and blurred, but clearly recognisable. The statues from the new Reich Chancellery were now in Soviet hands. We're off to Eberswalde, on the hunt for eyewitness accounts. And we meet a man who says he saw the horses here. Hans May, a former mayor of Eberswalde, was one of the few who was allowed to enter the tightly guarded military base.
The first time I was here, I was very surprised by these huge figures standing there. I thought, well, they're probably depicting some typical Stalinist heroic epic.
For decades, the horses stood here, but then one day they disappeared again, without a trace. The Soviet commander said it was for charity.
When the big earthquake hit Alma-Ata, they were taken away and melted down as aid for the earthquake victims.
The commander's words were a lie. The truth was very different.
The sculptures then disappeared in 1989 under very mysterious circumstances.
Once again, the story takes an incredible turn, and one theory says that this man played a key role. Alexander Schalck-golodkowski, colonel of East Germany's notorious secret police, the Stasi. His task to procure foreign currency for East Germany by any means possible, including selling Nazi art to West German collectors. It's believed that this might be how Hitler's horses made it across the inner German border.
But because it was clear that this was not actually legal, he had them secretly sawed apart and then had the parts added to legal art transports, and that's how they smuggled them across the inner German border.
Hitler's horses sawed into pieces and then hidden in a warehouse somewhere in West Germany for decades.
In the 70s and 80s, the market was dominated by the Russians and the Stasi, because after the war, the Russians had confiscated a lot of Nazi art. And in the 70s and 80s, they needed hard currency. So they started a trade secretly to sell these confiscated Nazi art to collectors in the West, sometimes neo-Nazis or old Nazis. Can you imagine communists selling secretly Nazi art to old Nazis? So it was a very big market, and it still is a big market. I think we are talking about tens or hundreds of millions.
Nazi sculptures from the new Reich Chancellery now in the hands of Nazi art enthusiasts. But exactly whose hands and where remained a mystery, until 2013 when they resurfaced on the secret art market. Now the hunt was in full swing. In Berlin, Chief Inspector Allange filled meters of shelf space with evidence and clues. But so far, they were leading nowhere.
The investigation was pretty much stalled after several months of intensive research. The sales offers didn't lead us to the goods. We still didn't know who had the sculptures. The investigations died down for a bit, but things started moving again in late 2014.
Things were different in Amsterdam, where Arthur Brand suddenly had a lead. A dubious art dealer, codenamed Steven, said he could help Brand buy the horses. Steven seemed to know exactly who had them. Brand showed up to their appointment with a hidden camera on his jacket. The detective said he had a rich client from the US who wanted the horses and that he was just the middleman. Meeting in a restaurant, Brand convinced Steven that his client was serious. But who was the secret seller?
Want hoe klonk hij vanmorgen toen je sprak? Je zei dat je vanmorgen had gebeld, hè? Ja. Daar is hij er netjes voor, maar hij moet en zal ze... Kijk even mee.
They left the restaurant to smoke. Both sides were cautious, but the deal seemed to be going through.
Hij wil alles wel tekenen, dat maakt helemaal geen moer uit. Nee, ik hoop dat jouw klant of de verkoper net zo enthousiast is, net zo graag er vanaf wil, zeg maar, om het even goedkoop te zeggen.
It was still unclear who had the horses, but three suspects emerged at once.
We had three persons which we focused on, and I discovered that some of them had relations to strange people. People who have a big name in the neo-Nazi circles, like lawyers and other people. Also to a group called Stille Hilfe, which is a neo-Nazi group. I always suspected that some of this money might have gone to the wrong people.
Brandt suspected that the seller had ties to Gudrun Böwitz, a supporter of the extremist group Stille Hilfe, or Silent Help. Known as the Nazi Princess, Böwitz was the daughter of SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Böwitz might have wanted the money to support Nazis and neo-Nazis facing prosecution. With that suspicion, Brandt travelled to Berlin in 2015, becoming Allange's most important witness.
So I went there, it was at night, I was in this big building, it was dark. Sometimes I forget something and Allange said, remember well, think again. So we were sitting there and I was giving my testimony about Wolf, about Flick, Bodenstein, because he needed that as a witness to make these raids.
We questioned Arthur Brand here in Berlin in May 2015. That was very important testimony, because for the first time he was able to describe to us in detail the people he'd been in contact with, what he'd perhaps already seen, and what he thought about this case. And from all of those things, 3 persons of interest emerged for us, people we thought might have the horses.
The morning of May 20th, 2015, showdown. 200 police launched raids on the 3 suspects. One of those raids took place in Bad Dürkheim in the south of Germany. The search was finally on, but there were no horses in sight.
It was the worst day of my life, the worst day. I could not be there because I was the main witness. And I got more and more nervous sitting in my chair in the Netherlands, and I thought, oh my God, I have to go in hiding. This is the biggest mistake of our life.
Then a call came.
And then I saying, we have the horses.
Hitler's horses from the new Reich Chancellery were finally found in a warehouse in Bad Dürkheim in southwest Germany, in the possession of a respected businessman identified as Rainer W. The statues, recovered 70 years after they went missing, were immediately confiscated.
All the panic went away, and they were standing there, you know, somewhere hidden on an industrial area for all these years. The Wall Street Journal called it the most interesting find in decades.
The recovered Hitler horses made headlines around the world. Back in Berlin, 2022. The Spandau Citadel, the largest Renaissance building north of the Alps. The vast complex on the edge of Berlin is where the horses were brought and put on display for the first time, as part of the Unveiled exhibition. The traces of their history remain visible. A decision was made not to restore them.
The horse is covered in stories. It really has traces of history all over it. If you wanted to proceed chronologically, you can start with the bullet holes, which were probably made around April 45 to about June 45. It is possible that the bullet holes were made when Gießen was under fire, but it is also possible that Soviet soldiers deliberately shot at them again later. The other marks on the horse are here, where it was welded back together after the collector had them smuggled across the inner German border and then reassembled. And the next marks that were made are the abrasion marks from the red belts, which you can actually see because when the police transported them, they were strapped to the vehicle with red belts.
The horses raised the question, what should be done with Nazi art?
The question of whether there's such a thing as toxic art is a big discussion, and I'm glad it's being discussed. I don't want to give a conclusive answer because I think it's the discussion that's so important. I think society has to deal with controversial monuments being seen in public, not only in museums. But in the case of the horses, I do think it was right that they are in a protected space where people can decide if they want to see them or not, and where they can't have the effect that was originally intended.
Without the aura of power, the horses stand separated, one in the exhibition, the other in the casemate of the Spandau Citadel. Soon, this horse too will be unpacked and presented to the public. And so ends this very German tale of Hitler's horses. Just a 10-kilometre beeline from the new Reich Chancellery, where they once stood as confident symbols of a dictatorship that was soon to crumble. And the detectives? René Allange is investigating a spectacular new case, trailing more art criminals. Arthur Brandt wrote a book about the case that's been translated into 15 languages. And he's still working, searching for missing art. And the final chapter? A Hollywood studio has secured the rights to the material. The thriller about the horses that trotted their way through 20th century German history. One day we will very likely see the stallions again, this time on the big screen. Art that's inseparably linked to a murderous ideology. We'd like to hear what you think. What should be done with Nazi art? Should it be displayed, hidden, destroyed? Let us know in the comments.